If your animation is finished, or if you just want to see how it's looking, there's a good chance that you'll need to know how to output your animation into a video. So let's take a look at how to do that. Well, firstly, there's actually two ways of outputting your video, or actually what you see. You could do a viewport render, which is basically, as the name suggests, this is just outputting what you see in the Blender viewport. It's also called an OpenGL render or a play blast. And then there's an actual render, a real render, for lack of a better phrase. This is where we're using the scene's camera, as well as all the lighting and the materials that you've set up for your scene. But if you just want to take a quick look at what you're animating, there's no point wasting hours and hours rendering each frame just to find out that you still got some work to do. That's where the viewport render comes in. It's really quick and really fast. Awesome. To render our viewport, you just go to the View menu in any of the 3D viewports, and then down near the bottom, you've got three options here. This option will do one single frame, whatever the current frame is. This will render your whole entire animation from the start frame to the end frame, and this one would only render out the keyframes for the selected object. This is useful for character animation, but more often than not, this is the option that you'll like to choose. When we choose that, it will render what we see in the viewport into the animation using your settings over here. If you wanted to do a real render, that is in the render menu up here. You have the option for rendering the still frame, which is F12, or rendering the entire animation, which is Control F12. So both of those ways of rendering will use the output settings here. So let's take a look at them. So in your output tab, which is the one that looks like the printer here, the output properties, you see at the top the dimensions. You can change the resolution here, and you'll notice that the size of our camera is changing, and that is because the camera is linked to these resolution settings here. You don't need to select the camera and then change the data of the camera. It's set with the output. Now the X resolution is the width and the Y resolution is the height. You can set it to be whatever you want, but I've just changed it back to 1920 by 1080, which is the default. Now this option here is if we wanted to do say 50%, that's going to use 50% of these options here, which is really handy if you just want to do a test render. And then when we're ready to do the final render, you can bump it up to 100%, or even it's quite common to bump it up to 200% and then scale it down post-production to get a better result. Although that's more common when you're doing one single frame rather than an entire animation. Now this little menu here will give you some presets that you can actually quickly switch to. So if you wanted to do a 720 render, just choose that, and then you'll see it's changed my resolution there. So down here is your start and your end frame, which is also over here. You already know how to do that, as well as the frame settings over here. So let's take a look at the output. This here is where you're going to save your file. By default, your Blender scene will probably start looking something like this, which is your temporary folder on your computer. What I like to do is create a double slash, and that will be a shortcut to save your work in the same working directory as your blend file, and then I create a folder underneath that called render. And if this folder doesn't exist, Blender will create it for you. And so then I put all my files in there, whether that's a video format or an image sequence. You can also just click on this icon here, which will bring up the file browser. Then you can locate the folder where you want to save it, just double click, and then name it down here, testrender.mp4, and accept that. But I find it's a lot easier and quicker just to type straight into the box here. So here is where you actually change the file format for your output. The two columns on the left are image formats, and the column on the right is a video or a movie format. The default setting is a PNG file, which is obviously an image. Now when you choose an image format, Blender will create an image sequence. That is one image per frame, starting at your start frame, going all the way to your end frame. And it will save it in this location here. Now currently this name doesn't make sense because I have changed it, but what I like to do when creating an image sequence is just leave a trailing underscore at the end, because when it creates these image files, it's going to append the frame number as well as the file extension, which is in this case is PNG, and that's going to create a nice looking file. Whereas if we choose one of the movie formats, I'll just choose the most common one now, which is by far the most useful of these three formats. I'll choose that. What I like to do is give it the full name and the extension, and if the extension matches our settings down here, it won't append any frame names. And this is the actual file name that Blender will output. So with the video format, we have a few extra settings. Down here we have the container, that's the type of file that we're going to output, say an MP4 or a Matroska or any one of these, a QuickTime video. By default, the setting is Matroska, but if I want to create an MP4, I can choose MP4. And then we also have the video and the audio codec. Now, there is no audio in this actual animation, but if we wanted to add the audio, say if we had some sound in our video sequence editor, which I'll show you later, then I would choose an AAC or MP3. They're both very good options, but I will leave it as no audio for now. Here is our video codec, and you'll see it's H.264 is the chosen option there. And that is a really good codec in my opinion. Now, if you don't want to bother with all these settings, we do have some presets up here. So you can just quickly switch to any one of these presets. Then the preset that I use is the H.264 MP4. So that'll change my settings here, which they didn't change because it was already set to that. But don't forget, if you wanted to add audio, you do need to choose one of these options, say MP3. So under the metadata, we actually have some ways to burn in some extra information into our video file. Now, it doesn't make sense to do this in your final render because it's actually adding text overlaying your actual image, but it's really great for your work in progress. So if you wanted to append the frame number to your animations, which is something quite handy to do when you're collaborating, you just turn on the frame counter there and then make sure that you enable burn into image. Then when I do a viewport render or a final render, it will show up here. Now you can change those settings down here. If we want to make it bigger, we can change the text color, and let's say the background area, we don't want that to have any transparency. Let's raise the alpha. Now let's render this again. You'll see that I've changed it there. You also have many other options that you can burn into your image. And then finally, we have the post-processing section. This is where we can tell Blender to use the compositor or use the data that's inside our video sequence editor. By default, both of these are checked. However, if you do not have any data in the compositor or the video sequence editor, it will be skipped at render time. We'll take a look at the video sequence editor a little bit later on, but doing compositing is outside the scope of this video. You can check out some of the many other courses on CG Cookie to learn all about that. Now, if you wanted to change the way that Blender behaves when you actually render it out, you can do so in the preferences. So if we go to Edit, Preferences, and we go to Interface, you'll see down here under the editors, there is the temporary window here. We can change the way that Blender behaves when it does a render. We can say create a whole new window for that render. We can just switch the current viewport to an image editor, or we can go full screen. I prefer the image editor, but you might prefer creating a new window. So let's just have a look at that. So now when we go view render, that is a whole new window, but I find it gets in my way. Now, once your animation is actually rendered, whether you've just rendered the viewport or done a final render, you can actually view your animation up here in the render menu. If you wanted to look at that single image that you just rendered, that is the shortcut F11. But if you wanted to watch the animation, it is Control F11. That will bring up the animation. It just brought it up on my other monitor here. Some of the many things that can go wrong. When you do a viewport render, it will show everything that you can see in your viewport. If you wanted to turn some things off, you need to make sure that you disable them before you do the viewport render. There's a quick way of turning off all of your overlays with this button up here. That will turn off all the non-renderable things in the final render. That will disable them in the viewport. However, if you just wanted to turn some things off, say if you didn't want the 3D cursor to be visible, you can turn it off there, or you can hide it outside of the view. You also have some other options here to turn things on and off for visibility. If you wanted to hide a whole type of object, say you didn't want to see the armatures here, you can go to the Object Type Visibility menu and then just disable all of the armatures in our viewport. However, if you wanted to disable one and not the others, don't forget you can also disable them over here individually. So if I didn't want the multi-ball rig to show, I can just disable it here. If you're not seeing all of these options, make sure that you turn on your filters just by enabling them or disabling them here. And just in case you don't know what these icons do, the arrow icon means that you're making that object or collection unselectable, so you can't accidentally select it in the viewport. The eyeball icon will disable the object or the collection inside the current view layer, whereas the screen will disable it in all view layers. That is in all scenes that happen to be in your file, as well as any scenes where this is linked into. And here is your render visibility. If you don't want it to show up in the render, then just click this one, but it'll still be visible in your viewport. Now, if for some reason in your scene you don't have an active camera or you have the wrong camera active, you can change it quite easily. This is the camera that I want to be active, but it is not, because you can see the triangle here is not filled in. Our active camera is over here in space doing nothing. It is active because of this filled in triangle. So this is my good camera, this is my bad camera. To change the active camera, we can do that in the scene settings over here. Just changing our camera to be the good camera. You'll see that now that is the active one. Or you can do it with the menu here. So you can go View, Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera. So that would change it there. So now I've changed it back to the bad camera. Let's fix that. I will select our good camera again and use the shortcut Control Numpad 0. And now we've fixed it. Another way of doing it is just eyedropping here. So we can just select the eyedropper and select it there. So here's a common mistake. You hit render and it is completely black, or it looks really, really dark like this. So what's going on? The most common cause is that you don't have any lighting in your scene. So it is rendering completely black. Or in our case here, the only lighting that we have is from the materials on our Stomp character. So lighting is actually beyond the scope of this course, but make sure you check out many of our other courses which are all about lighting in 3D. But this is a common beginner error. So is your image not showing with transparency? Well, let me show you how to fix that. Firstly, we need to make sure that our output is choosing one of the image formats that supports transparency. PNG is one of those. We also need to make sure that we've activated the alpha channel and not just RGB. So make sure that you choose RGBA, which stands for alpha. Next, we need to enable it in our render, which is in the render properties. It's in a weird spot, but under film, you'll see an option called transparent. So if you want cycles to show transparent, make sure that you choose that. And if you want Eevee to do the same, it is also in the film tab there. So now when you render, you've got alpha. So that should be enough information for you to get your actual animations out of your Blender file in either an image sequence format or an actual video format. And hopefully some of those tips are going to help you in the future. All right, I'll see you in the next video.